Welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you for coming tonight. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Clarissa Ward, who's a CBS correspondent. She's going to chair tonight's discussion, and she was actually in Syria at the end of last year and interviewed two fighters that had gone over, so has first-hand experience of the subject we're talking about tonight. Before I do that, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we're filming this evening's event. So over to Clarissa.
Good evening. Very interesting discussion this evening, and obviously very much in the news and very much on the forefront of everyone's minds, particularly here in Europe. The guests this evening, I probably don't actually need that much introduction. If you've turned on your TV anytime in the last 6 months, you know who Shiraz is. Shiraz Maher is a senior researcher with the King's College Institute for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence, and Shiraz's main area of expertise that he's been concentrating on lately is the number of Western fighters in Syria and in Iraq, talking to them, finding out about the various groups they're with, monitoring their online activity. He's also an expert on Salafist jihadi ideology. And then one along, of course, we have Moazzam Begg. Again, does not need much introduction, probably one of 9 British citizens who was held at Guantánamo Bay. He also recently spent 7 months in prison in the UK after a trip to Syria, which I'm sure he will tell us more about. He's the director of Cage Prisoners and also the author of Enemy Combatant. And then to the far left here, we have Richard Barrett, who's the Senior Vice President for Special Projects at the Soufan Group. They recently did a very interesting study on how some of the leaders of ISIS all met, and it turns out that most of them met at America's largest military prison in Iraq, which was Camp Bucca. And of course, Richard has extensive diplomatic and intelligence experience over the years, so he'll be able to provide a unique perspective. So to start off the discussion, I'm going to let each of the gentlemen make some introductory remarks for like 4 minutes each or so, and then we'll start to have more of a conversation, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So without further ado, Shiraz.
Thank you, Clarissa. I think with regard to the discussion on returnees, there's probably only 2 points that I want to make. The first is that timeline and chronology is very important in the Syrian context. This is a conflict that has changed and morphed continuously throughout the years and since its inception. And in the course of that evolution of the conflict, we've seen an evolution of the individuals, of the groups that are operating on the ground, of motivations, of aims, and that kind of thing. And so I think when you're looking at that sort of sense of it then, in terms of who is returning, you might want to classify them in 3 different ways. There's been this media narrative, and narrative that's been driven by the Home Secretary quite a lot, which has been to say, if you go to Syria, you're automatically deemed a terrorist. If you return to this country, you will be prosecuted. There were these headlines in the papers about a year ago saying that you'd be given a life sentence, essentially, for anybody who had gone to Syria. Now, that's clearly the wrong message to be sending. That's clearly the wrong approach to be taking in this context. There's 3 types of people, as I see it, who might be returning. There's obviously some people who might wish to return to Britain, to the West, who want to carry out a terrorist attack. They, of course, need to be dealt with by the criminal justice system. They need to be detected and stopped and so on. There are other people who will be disengaging for all sorts of reasons, but they are choosing to opt out of this conflict because it's not what they thought it was going to be, because they've been disillusioned by what they've seen there, because of the infighting that has taken hold, which started about this time last year, and so they're choosing to extract themselves from that situation. I have first-hand experience of talking to fighters who said that very thing, that the reasons that they came for have now changed, they're no longer present, they want to come back. Some of them have and have been arrested and prosecuted. Some of them have subsequently died in US coalition airstrikes out there. So that's another side of it. And then the other side, the third sort of person who might be returning, who we don't see enough, I don't think, attention focused on these guys. That we have to bear in mind that some of them who go to Syria are very, very young indeed. Some of them, there was a guy who died a few weeks ago from Leeds, who's 17 years old. Now consider the psychological effects that some of these people are going through, they're suffering from combat stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, that kind of thing, who are potentially returning, for whom prosecution is completely the wrong way to go. They need to be dealt with by mental health services, by NHS professionals who are going to help them reintegrate back into normal life because of the experiences that they've had. So there needs to be far more pragmatic and broader understanding of the issue of returnees. The final point I want to say on this is the more practical one, which is where I don't really have sort of a solution to, but clearly it's very difficult for a politician, for a practitioner who is involved in the front line of dealing with this, to begin to decipher, well, who is this person? Which of these sort of categories do they fall into? How do you essentially identify that potentially dangerous individual? And from the political perspective, at least, it's clear that politicians want to pull up the drawbridge. They don't want to be seen to be taking ownership of the problem, because they feel like if they do, and they let someone come back, and then something happens, the problem sort of rests with them. So they're taking this far more draconian approach, which is just to say, well, you've left. We're going to find ways to keep you out there by stripping passports, stripping citizenship. Again, another disgraceful move that the Home Office has been using in the last sort of 18 months or so. But that's the more practical element of this, which I think, I imagine there'll be lots of questions around. But that's what I want to say for now.
Moazzam?
Bismillah ar-Rahman. To me, this discussion about the foreign fighters and any potential threat they pose to the UK is one that has to go, we have to go back in history. And the conflict in Afghanistan, I think, is one of the most key points to look at when we're regarding foreign fighters in Britain and what do they mean. During the 80s, numerous people went over from Britain to fight in Afghanistan at a time when British foreign policy was in line with the Afghan Mujahideen and against the Soviet Union. In fact, perhaps a lot of people don't realize, but numerous fighters from Afghanistan, Mujahideen, were brought over to the United Kingdom. They were trained in the use of the blowpipe anti-aircraft missile system in Snowdonia and in the Highlands. Being British, it turned out to be rubbish, and it was replaced by Stinger. And everybody knows that Stinger changed the whole scenario in Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen began to win. Nobody ever thought at that time, nobody thought that the word jihad or Mujahideen was synonymous with terrorism, except for the Soviet Union. That has completely changed. It was odd, when I was held in the Bagram detention facility by the Americans, I could still see, while we were chained and hooded and shackled and so forth, the writing in Russian that this superpower had taken over this poorest of nations in the world, and its legacy has been taken over by the next superpower. And part of that legacy has been the creation of the war on terror and then what follows after. So the issue really to me is this. The majority of the foreign fighters, of course, we're talking about Europe, but the majority of the foreign fighters in Syria are actually from the Arab world. They're not from Britain, and they're not from Holland, and they're not from Germany. We tend to jump ahead and place ourselves where we actually don't deserve to be in the discussion. If you look at the majority of the fighters, they're from Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Jordan, and they have their own problems. And you can see what the greater attraction to those people is. Part of that attraction is being alienated, is being in countries where despotic regimes have been imprisoning and torturing. It's unsurprising to find Libyans, to find Tunisians, to find Egyptians bolstering the ranks of IS and other groups in this region. It's unsurprising because they have essentially been under decades of torture. In fact, the reason why I ended up going to Syria was in pursuit of this. That's just to tell you my own little connection to this. When I was held in the Bagram detention facility, the Americans told me while I was being tortured that if I don't cooperate, I will be sent either to Syria or to Egypt for interrogation. And I learnt within custody that they had sent people to Syria and to Egypt, that there was intelligence cooperation between Britain and America and Mubarak's Egypt Gaddafi's Libya and Assad's Syria. When I came out from Guantánamo, one of the things I did was to start investigations, and part of my investigations took me to Libya, where I met numerous people who had been renditioned with British complicity, and indeed one individual who had been renditioned with Syrian complicity. And it was through that strand that I went to Syria and started meeting with former prisoners who later became rebel leaders. The attraction that people have to go there, as Shiraz said, initially in those days, in 2012, in the early parts of the revolution, was part of the Arab Spring, and we seem to have forgotten that. That what began with the Bouazizi in Tunisia, when he lit himself and made that statement that I am rising up, Ash-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam, that the people want to bring down the regimes. That's what happened in Syria. But it was different, because whereas the response in the other countries, although brutal like it was in Egypt and in Libya, was nowhere near as terrible as it became in Syria. And so these protesters, these ordinary people who came out in the streets to show their solidarity with the rest of the Arab Spring and the Arab Spring nations, were being targeted. And for those of you who don't know, there's a history in Syria, and that history is to do with the Hama uprising, or the killing, the massacre of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I can tell you, in the region, in the place where I lived, the village where I lived in Syria, was a man called Abu Ahmed. And this man had told me about how he was imprisoned by Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar's father, for 16 years in Tadmor prison, and how his eye was poked out, and how he saw people being executed at the rate of 50 to 60 a day, until around 20,000 were killed. So it was his children who are parts of the leadership in the area where I was staying. They were leading the revolution. They were leading the protests. And it was these images that when people saw from here and the rest of the world, that propelled them to go and help. Primarily because, unlike Libya, which doesn't have oil, Syria didn't get that air power, didn't get that support. One of the arguments we've given in the past has been that numerous people went over from Britain to fight in Libya against Gaddafi. They joined Islamic groups. In fact, some of those Islamic groups now are in problems, as you can see. Nonetheless, the West backed them. How could it be terrorism for people to go and fight in Libya, and yet not be terrorism to go and fight in Libya, and yet be terrorism to do the same thing in Syria? It's confusing, and I'm one of the people who's confused. Because if it was terrorism, and even in Syria, if that is terrorism, and if it was terrorism at least up until the point when IS declared itself, then the British government has to be the first one in the dock, because it was supplying non-lethal aid to the Free Syrian Army up until January 2014. And it was supplying this non-lethal aid to the Free Syrian Army in the knowledge that it fought alongside with and shared resources with the Al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria. So people are very confused. A very confused message has been sent by the British government. The decision, and I'll stop here, the decision to prosecute people, knowing that people were coming and going back from Syria, up until after, in August 2013, when Cameron lost the vote for airstrikes in Syria. Shortly after that, the first Syria-related prosecutions began. Prior to that, there were none. So I'll just stop here, but there are numerous questions that need to be answered, and I hope that we'll be able to answer them.
Richard.
Fine. Well, I'll follow from that by perhaps mentioning something about the new legislation that's considered here, which is the other side of the discussion we're going to have today. And of course, I think we'd all agree that the law enforcement agencies, security services and so on need very clear legislation under which to operate. You don't want too much ambiguity. You want to be absolutely clear. And that legislation has got to have been through a process of public examination, not only in the Parliament, but also, I think, in discussion in the media and elsewhere. So when you get legislation, which actually in the bills, I think one of the phrases I noted was that somebody could be excluded if they were suspected of intending. You've got a suspected of intending, so a double ambiguity there. And when you have prosecutors asking judges to allow them to have a secret trial because the evidence they want to produce is very sensitive, I think you're bordering on very, very difficult territory, as the lawyers here would agree, I hope, that of, I'm not thought police, but close to somebody making a decision as to what an individual is thinking in order to bring a prosecution, and being able to do so without the public being present and having a look at that. And that is quite extraordinary in our society. And I think that it shows that a lot of these legislation and the policy that Moazzam was talking about now, which he's called confusing, is really 99% driven by domestic issues rather than by issues overseas. This problem that we have at the moment of foreign fighters, by definition, if they're called foreign fighters, must be a problem that has to do with policies in other countries. And if we relate it all to the possibility of their return and the damage they may do to us and construct our legislation accordingly, I think we miss a major part of the puzzle. So that was one point I wanted to say. And two others, I wanted to pick up on what Shiraz said about motivation. I think that to have a blanket approach to everybody who goes abroad to fight may be more relevant now in 2014, 2015, where if somebody goes over to fight in Syria, they are inevitably going to end up with the Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra, in my opinion, and they will know that, and they will know what that means. But it wasn't always true, as you said. There's a timeline relevant to this. But they're still individuals. They're still going with all sorts of different motivations. Those motivations had to be examined if you're going to bring a case against them, and if you're going to treat them in a harsh way when they come back or try to come back, which may lead to their further radicalization, which you wouldn't want if they're coming back, as you said, because they're horrified by what they've seen. And the other thing that I just wanted to pick up on what you said, I think, is the confusion about policy, not just for people who are living in this country who are perhaps seeking a sense of identity and wondering whether they're British or not British and how they would define themselves first by their religion or by their ethnicity or whatever, but also for people looking at us outside. And if we have an engagement in this fight, then it is an engagement because we reckon we stand for something, we promote something, and we have some sort of moral authority, at least perhaps, to talk about possible solutions. And if the confusion is, if you like, compounded by a confusion in our legal approach to the problem, I think then people outside think, well, why should we bother to listen? They seem no better than the regimes we're fighting. So I think there are all sorts of issues that we have to be incredibly careful about to move forward in some sort of positive contribution to the problem.
So I guess, just to start the discussion, I mean, maybe we can each go around and say, Shiraz, starting out with you, what do you think the British government should do with, let's take, for example, some of the fighters who you speak to, who've been there for some years, they want to come back to the UK, they claim that they have no desire to be engaged in any kind of dangerous activity here. How should the government be receiving these young men and women, indeed?
Well, I think there needs to be a mechanism by which we can begin to decipher who is going to be the most appropriate sort of frontline public body to deal with these individuals. As I was saying, there might very well be people who are coming back who are deeply psychologically traumatized by what they've seen. And so in that case, the NHS is going to be the sort of first port of call. How, at a practical level, you begin to do this, I don't know. I know some of the ideas that are being considered right now is to have a sort of voluntary presentation system where individuals who return present themselves to the government and essentially say, look, I'm coming back. And an assessment is made about that person. And the sort of idea is that the sort of onus is on them to come and present rather than the state having to find you, essentially. So I think the problem is one of trust here. You have to create a system where the individuals themselves have trust in the state, have trust in whatever initiative it is that you're going to put together, so that they feel relatively invested in it. And that's where I think it's going to be very, very difficult. For some of the reasons Moazzam outlines, that people are skeptical, people are confused. So I'm trying to think when it was. It was during the bank holiday. So probably going back several months now, there was a group of British fighters who contacted me and said, look, we'd like to come back. But there was a sense of fear in terms of what the government would do. And that is certainly the headlines that the Home Office has sought to put out around this. And again, I think what you're seeing in terms of the headline policy is one thing, but don't forget there are 200 and sort of plus people back in the UK who've been in Syria who have not been prosecuted. So it seems to me like there is a pragmatic policy actually that is at play already. But it's not one the government's doing a good job of communicating to people. And I think if it communicated that better, that look, we will be pragmatic, we will make a decision based on the individual. As Richard was saying, there's got to be more than just a sort of mere suspicion or sort of something, but let's have a sort of evidence-based discussion on that individual and his particular circumstances, and that might lead to something. The onus right now, I think, is more on government to sort of build trust for these individuals to buy in. I think and that's in everybody's favour.
So Moazzam, how do you think the British government can go about trying to determine which of these young men might pose a threat, which of them, to the contrary, could actually be an effective deterrent to young men who would consider going to join the Islamic State, for example? Do you believe, is it the job of the British government, or is it the job of Muslim communities?
Well, look at almost every arrest that I can think of related to Syria, and you can check this online if you want to. The police who've been entrusted with the task of arresting these people and protecting us, as it were, are very quick to note these few words: there was no threat to the safety or security of the British public. How often have we seen this with arrests? It happened in my arrest, and it happens in the arrests of almost every prisoner I've come across who I was held with in Belmarsh. So if the police are saying there's no threat, but the government's saying there is a threat, who's right? Where do you test whether there's a threat or not? Where's that tested? Is it tested in court? Because in court what happens is that they expand the parameters of what terrorism means and interpret it as they go along, so that a person like me can be prosecuted for sending a generator to Syria at a time when Britain is supplying generators to Syria. So that's what the government shouldn't be doing, yet it is doing that. The trust that we speak of cannot be built up because everybody's already afraid to come back to the UK, not based on what the government has said, but based on what it's done. Belmarsh is filled now, or not, it has numerous prisoners there who have been prosecuted, some who were in Syria for 12 days, some for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. 2 young boys I was held with in Belmarsh, from the ages of 19 years old, have received 13-year sentences, despite the fact that they pled guilty. And the reason why they pled guilty was because they felt that in the environment that exists now, though they were never part of IS, in fact they left Syria because of IS. They didn't want to be, as Shiraz said, be part of that infighting between the various groups. They weren't ideologically attached to it. They said, this isn't what we came for, we want to leave this place, and they came back and they got arrested and they were prosecuted under the various terrorism legislations, and have now been given a 13-year sentence for pleading. They pled guilty. Here's a point. Had they been found guilty, what does that mean? That they would have received an 18-year sentence? Otherwise, what is the incentive to plead guilty? So that's where we are at right now as we speak. This happened just a few weeks ago.
But do you believe in your I mean, clearly there's many instances of issues where people are being imprisoned under, confusing at best circumstances. Do you believe that there is a legitimate threat, or do you think this has been overhyped?
Well, as I said, where do you test this concept of threat? In court or before the MI5? Who tests the concept of threat? And you've all seen it. Sometimes it's critical, sometimes it's severe, sometimes it's imminent. you think that it's going to happen any minute. That's the threat that the government talks about. But I bring you back to what do the police say on the arrests. So what do you mean by threat? What do you mean by terrorism? And I believe one of the reasons why my case fell apart before it got to court is because it would have tested the very concept. What does terrorism mean? Because as I've said before, if what I did was terrorism, then the government should be the first one in the dock. And so, getting back to the issue, the concept of the threat, thankfully, mercifully, in this country, there's only been one attack that's taken place successfully, and that's in 2005, in terms of a threat. But remember, those people who carried out those attacks weren't foreign fighters. They were radicalized here. They were radicalized in the UK. And so now we've done away with the radical imams. We've done away with as much as we can in terms. We've got more anti-terror legislation now than ever that we had at the height of the IRA campaign, when 3,000 people got killed in Britain, including the targeting of 10 Downing Street. And we're asking for more legislation. We're suggesting, we're pretending, we're lying to the people, saying that the threat is greater than it was at the time of the IRA. So my answer to you is this, is that whilst there will always be threats, there will be threats from people who you send to prison, it doesn't mean you never release them. If they've been deemed to be so dangerous that they'll never be released, that happens in some cases. But the majority of the people are not judged based on that. The majority of people are judged on the basis of the circumstances of the individual case. And what we're doing here is blanketly saying, I mean, look at this. Had the government had its way, I would have had, in terms of the maximum sentence, been serving 15 years for sending a generator to the rebels in Syria. That's unbelievable.
Right. And I think, look, also there's a difference, clearly, that it's sometimes a distinction we don't make terribly well in the media, but there's a difference between having an extremist ideology and actually being someone who's going to put a bomb in a public place and kill people, right? You can be someone who espouses what we might consider to be extreme or radical ideology, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be violent and murder civilians. So it is a difficult and nuanced thing to try to ascertain which people might fall into which category. But Richard, I wanted to ask you, in conjunction with what Moazzam was saying, and in conjunction with what's happened in Paris, and we look at these two young men who never went to Syria or Iraq, as far as we know. They went to Yemen, but essentially they were radicalized in France. And, you know, have intelligence services and governments become so consumed with their fear of returning foreign fighters and their, you know, fear of ISIS that they're kind of missing the boat on other forms of you know, attacks that are being planned in the meantime that don't necessarily relate to returning fighters?
Yeah, I don't think the authorities would distinguish between a threat that related to returning foreign fighters and a threat that was domestically grown.
But that's where, haven't all the efforts really been poured into returning fighters?
Well, perhaps there's some focus on foreign fighters for very obvious reasons. First of all, if they're going out to fight in a place like Syria, they're going to come back probably more accustomed to violence, and if they were horrified by it, they're going to come back quite traumatized by that violence. And I think there's also another point that people would worry about, that people coming back are like the Kouachi brothers, even if they didn't go and fight in Syria, that they're sort of part of a network, that they can get tapped on the shoulder. They have absolutely no intention of doing anything, but some guy that they were living next to in the trenches type of thing comes and says, look, you couldn't just help with this or do that, or we're thinking of doing this, and the process of radicalization then may start again. Okay, well, that's perhaps, and we shouldn't always be operating on perhapses, but nonetheless it's something that must concern the authorities. And I think that the one problem with terrorism as a crime, whatever terrorism is that there's absolutely zero tolerance of it. There's no other crime that we have zero tolerance of. We accept that there's going to be murders, there are going to be awful sorts of crimes. You know, we've been reading a lot about paedophilia, for example, and stuff like that. We accept that it goes on, we must do what we can to prevent it and imprison those who are guilty of it, but we don't have zero tolerance in the way we have zero tolerance of terrorism. And therefore it comes back again to what's the public demand, of the politicians and of the law enforcement and security agencies. They demand complete protection from terrorism. And we heard the Director General of the Security Service say the other day that there had been 3 terrorist attacks recently that he'd somehow preempted, somehow prevented. And I think that in the summer, David Cameron said that he was aware of 6 within the EU, and that's certainly gone up since then. So there are these attacks, and they need proper attention. But as the Karachi brothers showed, as you said, that you can have attacks coming out of not exactly left field, but certainly out of somewhere towards, from the middle towards left field, because one of them seems to have gone to Yemen. It's not now clear which, because they might have used each other's passports or whatever, but that was 2011. How long are you going to watch these guys? And that's why you can't leave this job up to the security agencies alone. It has to be a community responsibility. And at the moment, if someone from the community, in many communities, I would say, in this country and in France, goes to the police and says, I'm a bit worried about so-and-so, he came back from Syria looking a bit odd now, behaving badly, he is considered possibly by a fair percentage of his fellow members of the community as somehow betraying the community rather than supporting the community. Now that's a fundamental issue. I think it happens much less now than it did 4 or 5 years ago, but that is key, that the community as a whole should see the monitoring, if you like, of people who are vulnerable to the sort of radicalization that we see in Syria and Iraq, that they would see that as a positive thing for their community, for the country they live in, and everything else.
But they don't. I mean, when you look at a strategy like Prevent, for example, I mean, many Muslim communities, or Muslims within their communities, view it as a form of spying.
Well, let me take you up on that. Let's look at France, if we may, okay? And one of the first people killed in France was a Muslim who was working in the Charlie Hebdo offices, okay? Fine. He was working there. He knew what they were doing. That didn't make him question his religion or his job or anything else. He carried on. The policeman who was shot in really horrific cold blood lying on the street, it was a Muslim. Okay? Fine. You can say, well, so what? But, there was the story of one of the workers in the kosher supermarket who was helping to hide some of the hostages there in the cold store so that they wouldn't be killed by Qualibé. So, I mean, there's a narrative there. And in France, where there's a bigger percentage of Muslims in the population than any other European country, I think it's about 8%. So let's say that equates to about 5 million people, would do roughly 8% of the French population. So what are we talking about? We're talking about, so far as I know, about 1,200 who've gone to Syria. Let's say there's another 1,500 or so who might have thought about it or sympathized with them in some way. So if you've got, say, roughly 2,500 people in France, I'm trying to do some quick maths here, but I reckon at 5 million people, that's about half of 0.1% who might be in some way involved in this radicalization. I don't see a community there that's completely radicalized, but I do see the way that the French response and the European response, maybe even the response here to a certain extent, has been formulated. It forces people into an identity. Are you a returning foreign fighter? Are you a Muslim? Are you a French guy? Are you a French immigrant? And the way you project that, particularly in the media, determines where you see, as it were, the guilt. And I think in France, quite difficult to say when you look at across the range of French reporting where the media are pointing the finger.
And I think if you talk to a lot of French Muslims, and obviously they in no way condone what the Kouachi brothers did, but at the same time, they're not very pleased by necessarily the way the government is the government's policies.
That's a different matter, isn't it? Because you get a lot of young people. But it puts them in an
awkward position when it comes to what you're talking about, getting on the phone and calling your local police officer and saying, well, one of these guys in my class, he feels... You're more likely to want to deal with it yourself than hand it over to the government if you don't have faith that it's going to be dealt with properly.
Let me just give you an example here in the UK. There was the police were encouraging people. I remember the head of counter-terrorism in Birmingham was encouraging a group of young women or older women, asking them that if you think that your son may be going to Syria or is considering it, here are your options. Your options are he goes to Syria and possibly he gets killed, or he comes back to the UK and serves 10 years in prison. These are the options that she was giving them. So one woman did, one of the young kids I was talking about who was convicted a few weeks ago, his mother did go to the police. She did say that, I think my son has gone to Syria. As a result of that, they recorded that he'd gone to Syria, and when he came back, he got arrested as a result of that. Now, what do you think that does to the relationship between the mother and the son? And in the end of all of that process, again, we've got to come back to the threat. If there's a threat, I understand, we're all agreed. We've got to prevent the threat. But don't see a threat in everything that's happening. So that's what is happening here, that we're being told that these people are terrorists, but they never posed a terrorist threat. That's the problem we're having here right now.
So Shiraz, I mean, you talk to a lot of these young men, and you've been talking to them now for a period of several years. Do you see, when you engage in a dialogue with them, a shift in their perspective, a shift in their level of radicalization, any shift in what kind of a threat they could possibly pose?
So again, if I come back to the sort of timeline that I was talking about, I've really only been talking to them since November or October of 2013, so we're about 15, 16 months into that process. Lots of them die, of course, in between, so no one's been talking to me for that full period of time. Again, the people who went at the start, I would see their motivations, people I was talking about who were there in 2013, as being very, very different to the types of people who are getting up today to go and join predominantly Islamic State, and they go to be part of that and to be part of that project and part of that scheme. But again, if we go back to the original foreign fighters, you saw a lot more focus on humanitarian relief for the Syrian people, a lot more discussion about, we're here to help the people, we're here to protect them against the oppression of the Assad regime, we're here to deliver aid as well. And I think you'd be hard pressed to not see the moral sort of component of what they're doing. What the Assad regime did to its people and did to its country is inexcusable. And it's remarkable that all the discussion on Syria now actually takes place about the excesses of Islamic State, and we forget what Assad has done, despite, if you look at it in raw numbers, Islamic State doesn't rival him in the slightest. So I completely understood why these individuals were going, and as I say, there's a difference, a sort of qualitative difference, I would say, in terms of what they were doing. The people who tended to go later on were going, as I say, partly as a result of the declaration of the caliphate by Islamic State. They want to be part of that scheme. They want to be part of that. They are much more, you could say, zealous. They're much more bought into and invested into the idea of Islamic State and what it wants to achieve out there. And so, again, in that capacity, they're very different. Now, in a handful of cases, I think it's also clear to say there are some people who have gone the other way. They've seen the infighting. They've seen that the fight has gone from this idea of trying to get Damascus, trying to get Assad, to, well, our group doesn't like Islamic State, or we've had a falling out with the Harar Sham, so let's go and kill these people. And they've lost the idealism of it, and they want to disengage. Or other people have been further radicalized during their time out there. They've been attracted to Islamic State, so it picks up a lot of defectors, of course, from within the region. And a lot of people, it should be said, they're not just being attracted to Islamic State because of what it's offering, but they've been really annoyed by the Western intervention as well. And that's caused a lot of people to defect over. They're saying, well, the West isn't just hitting Islamic State, it's hitting Harar Sham, it's hitting Jabhat al-Nusra. So as a result of that, we need to sort of unite against this greater enemy. I mean, if you want to help all these groups coalesce and overcome their differences, that's the way to do it. I wrote a piece a few months ago for the New Statesman talking about the sort of Portsmouth guys who went. And they were a good example of one of them who originally got out there. His name's Hamidur, who was working at Primark, who originally was very much about saying, look, we're here for the humanitarian purpose, we're here to help the people. But by the end, I said to him, look, a lot of people in Raqqa don't want Islamic State. And he said, doesn't matter, we're not here for them. We're here to impose the rule of Allah, as he sees it. So you see that shift in that original onus has now given way to something else. It does happen, but it happens with different individuals in different ways.
Okay, I don't want to be too greedy, and I'm sure all of you have lots of questions, so I don't know where the microphone is, but, Millicent has it.
Thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant, former intelligence analyst for Customs and Excise. My question is very partly based on experiences working in Yemen with the World Bank, where I advised them that our project, which wasn't not a law enforcement, it wasn't a security project, wasn't going to work because of the deteriorating situation, and a plan B and a plan C was needed, which was given to the World Bank, but this was not the World Bank, and therefore they didn't listen to it, and then a few months later they had to evacuate everyone. How do you think it is possible to improve early warning within the country, domestically, within Britain and France, given the points you've made about the particular community itself generally still being rather reluctant to notify the authorities? Do you think there's real prospects of improving that? I have to say I'm somewhat skeptical, because I'm not sure that, like, education and health workers and so on and social workers are really very, very good at treading into law enforcement and intelligence work, and perhaps the other way around. I think that's going to take a lot of work.
Richard, do you want to take a stab on that one?
Sure. Well, let's look at Yemen specifically. I mean, the problems of Yemen are legion, as you know, and the problem of terrorism is very low down on that list. I mean, right now it's a bit more because you've got the Houthis coming in, but why the Houthis there and Al-Qaeda attacking them is very much a reflection of domestic politics in Yemen between the ex-president Saleh and the current president. And I was in Yemen a couple of months ago, I guess, and I asked people like the American ambassador, the British ambassador, and others, I said, why are you here? You know, a lot of you, it's a difficult place, why are you here? They all said, oh, because of the terrorist threat. Well, what do you think the Yemenis understand why they're there? They know that those guys are there because of the terrorist threat. So they say, oh yeah, we got a terrible terrorist threat, we really need your help, because they need the international attention, the capacity building and all this sort of thing. So, and I remember this conversation very well, because we were talking about Guantánamo, and we were talking about the Yemenis there and getting them back and all those sorts of issues. And so I said to the Yemenis, and it was a separate meeting, so what do you think you need to be able to bring for the Americans to send those Guantanamo detainees back? All been cleared for release, they'd never been found guilty of anything, you know, they would just get them out of there. And they said, oh, well, we need this sort of rehab center. It was pretty much on the Saudi model. So, you know, it's crazy. It's not Saudi, it's Yemen. But why did they say that? Because that's the model that the Americans and others say, oh, you need this. And when they say, oh, you need this, oh, yeah, sure we do. Of course we do. Because it's all about something else. So I think that when you say, okay, how do we deal with the threat in a country like Yemen? Yemen, in fact, has one of the most vibrant civil societies, I would say, in the Middle East. You know, if there's a tremendous amount of people, even we had a Nobel Prize winner, for God's sake, in Yemen. There's a tremendous amount of people who are really interested in the development of society in a stable country where you don't have so much north-south divide and sectarian divide and so on. They need empowering, surely, don't they? I mean, they need to find a stronger place in politics, and their interest in the stability and the future of their country will result in them, you know, and it's very much tribal society, and them all agreeing, okay, yeah, we don't want these guys with us. They're a pain in the neck. You know, we need to get rid of them. And therefore, I don't agree that early warning should come from outside observers. Early warning should come from the communities themselves.
Actually, to the situation in the UK, I was only.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm taking back to your Yemen thing. That in the UK, Similarly, we're talking about British people here. The British people should be interested in a peaceful and stable society which is evolving, and therefore, I don't think it's inconceivable at all that they should say, we don't want these guys, Kouachi type people, running around causing mayhem.
Moazzam, just in conjunction with that, what do you think needs to be done to build up a little bit more trust, or to build up better lines of communication between the government or between law enforcement offices and the imams, the youth centers, or whatever, centers of community there might be?
Gosh, I remember growing up during the 70s and the 80s when there was all sorts of racism, but it was directed clearly to various peoples from different groups. The Irish were the primary recipients of being called terrorists, and everybody else was called all the derogatory names for being black or ethnic minority groups. Now, it's obviously anti-Islamic statements being made, not just in the media and ordinary people feel it's okay to, but also politicians. And so there's a shift, and there's a very clear shift, and it talks about Islam as the problem. So if the government really wants to bring about trust, it has to step back a long way. Part of that stepping back has to do with repealing some of the laws that exist in relation to, for example, glorification of terrorism. For goodness sake, this is the land of Shakespeare, yet people have been convicted from the Muslim community for writing poetry. In some cases really bad poetry, but that's not the point. It's not why they were convicted. I wish that was the reason. They've been convicted. I know people who've been convicted for publication and distribution of books in the land of Wordsworth, where 100,000 publications are done every year in this country. I know this because I read Jeremy Paxman's The English in Guantánamo. The MI5 gave it to me. And so you see, what we've got here is something happening like the likes of which we've never seen in the UK. So we're not, and the government, the way it's going, that it wants to pass this counter-terrorism bill as law, whereby it wouldn't be just the royal prerogative, which is what's been used on people like me in the past to remove our passports. The police can do it on a whim. It'll be the police can remove your passport. The government can take away your nationality. You could be left stateless. You can be sent to internal exile. It doesn't sound like the Britain that I know. It sounds like something out of Eastern Europe during the height of the Cold War. And the problem is that the majority of the population will never feel its sting. It'll only be a targeted group. And I would say a targeted group within the targeted group. And as long as the majority of the population is happy with that, it really won't make any difference, because I think it's before Britain used to pride itself on how it treats its minorities. I think Mandela says you can tell a nation how good it is in how it treats its minorities. Now, I don't want to say that the Muslim community in this country is anywhere near the level of how it is in France, and I thank God that it's not. But we are slowly getting there. And with the introduction of these new laws, I can tell you de facto, it might not say in the letter of the law, in the statute, that this will only apply to Muslims, but it will only apply to Muslims, and maybe one or two Irish. So, yeah.
Lots of questions. Millicent, I'm going to let you choose because I don't want to get in trouble with people.
Hi, it's a question for Shiraz Maher. You said there were 200 foreign jihadi who came back and have not been prosecuted in UK. Is it does it mean the police know about these 200 but decided not to prosecute and maybe use them as intelligence sources, or is it that these 200 came back and are out of focus from police?
So the government's own figure on returnees is 260. So I said, 200 plus, because obviously clearly there are some prosecutions taking place. There are people waiting prosecution. So once you take them out of that 260, you're looking at about 200 odd people. Now, I don't know exactly why they haven't been prosecuted, whether it was a clear pragmatic decision that was made, whether a deal was entered into, whether and I suspect this is true in a lot of cases, there just clearly isn't enough evidence. I mean, what evidence do you really have? If you go out to Syria and you keep your mouth shut, which a lot of these guys don't do, but if you do, realistically, it's going to be hard to build a case against you. And just to be pictured in Aleppo, or even just to be holding a gun in Aleppo, doesn't denote membership of a group. It doesn't denote anything else, really. So I think in a lot of cases as well, if I'm real, it's probably just a lack of evidence as well that has stopped them from doing it.
This is also a question for you. I'm Laura Kramer with Clover Films. I'm just wondering if your research has identified some of the factors that contribute to whether these fighters will become more radicalized versus more disenchanted once they go over there. Besides the things that they see, how big of a factor is what their home life was like here?
Okay. Well, in terms of becoming more disenchanted or becoming sort of more hardline whilst they're out there, I really think it depends on the individual. And I've seen evidence on both sides. To clearly, some people have become really hardline or increasingly frenetic since they've been out there. And a good example of that, for example, is someone who's quite a well-known Dutch foreign fighter called Yilmaz, who is very popular. He's a very charismatic guy, and you can see, in fact, Clarissa interviewed him not too long ago. You can see in that interview he's clearly quite a different character to who he was at the start of this. I say others are saying, "Whoa, we came here to fight Assad. We didn't come here to get involved in this petty squabbling. We want none of it," and they want out. So I think it does matter. One of the interesting things I found though was that there's some interesting guys I talked to, and I think the more interesting ones are not in Islamic State. They're out. They're smarter. There's a guy from London. He's a very, very smart guy, and I think we've built quite a relationship. And what's interesting to see is he's someone who has a lot of manners. He's very courteous, and so we've built this good relationship. But as soon as the coalition bombing started, hasn't hit his group, and so. But he's really changed in terms of, it's fair game now. If someone wants to do something in the UK, that's completely acceptable. Whereas before, this guy who's anti the beheadings of Foley and Alan Henning and all that kind of stuff, there's been that shift. So we'd be remiss not to at least acknowledge that the coalition bombing has changed the game for a lot of people on the ground, including all of those as well who are not in Islamic State, who are not necessarily the victims of this. And so in terms of their home life, there isn't a model. There isn't a sort of characteristic you can say. Lots of these guys, though, clearly, to me at least, it's clear that they do struggle even now with the basic fact that essentially they're breaking their mother's heart by being out in Syria, and they all react to it in different ways. So some of them they don't want me to ask them about it, say look, enough, because it makes them think about it. Some of them don't call home very often, because when they do, they get their mother crying and stuff. So they try not to. They try to minimize the contact at home. But for a lot of them, it's that internal process. And as far as they're concerned, they say, "Look, we came here. We intend to die as martyrs and go to paradise." They believe that they can intercede for their family and take family members. So they say, "Look, my test is to come here and fight the jihad. My test is to struggle here and to accept all the difficulties of this. But my reward lies there." So for my parents, they are being de facto tested. Their test is necessarily not to come here, but is to essentially accept the heartbreak of my departure, and they'll be rewarded at the end of that as well. That's how they cognitively get around it.
Jim Maseda, NBC News, retired foreign correspondent. Sorry, Clarissa. We spent a lot of time, rightly so, talking about the reasons for radicalization. I wondered, and I'll just throw this out to all three gentlemen, the reasons for de-radicalization, or I should say, what progress has there been in de-radicalization? We hear from time to time, Kilium, we hear about from our friend Mr. Nawaz at Kilium. We know about the Danish program of incentives to try to wean people by offering them houses and cars and wean these foreign fighters off ideologically or change their thinking. Is there a program? Is there a path that has shown any kind of positive result that's worth investing in, do you think, right now? And I've got a specific question for you as well, Richard. Has your thinking at all changed since the events in Paris in terms of the draconian or robust, for perhaps a better word, nature of what you saw to be direction of UK law? Are you shifting at all in your own thinking because of these events and what could happen in the UK? And if so, how? What specifically do you see that you didn't see, let's say, back in the summer, that you see now that might work in terms of building up or beefing up UK law?
Richard, why don't you... Oh, sorry.
I'll answer your question. And the de-radicalization process, there's this suggestion that the only people who can do it are the governments and the people in the Muslim community and at large who oppose terrorism and so forth. And that's insulting our intelligence. It's insulting our intelligence as prisoners, as people who went out to Syria, who saw what happened. Who could better de-radicalize than those who saw what happened? You can talk and tweet as much as you like, but nothing compares to what you've seen on the ground yourself. And those people who've returned from Syria talk to people. And I'll give you an example. In prison, I saw numerous people, in fact, there are a large number of people who become Muslim in prison. And some of them are former gangsters, and some of them are former drug dealers and so forth. And they, like everybody else, see the attacks, the aerial bombardment and so forth on IS and all the other groups. They naturally feel angry, naturally. You don't need, they've never spoken to a radical imam in their lives, unless you want to call a prison imam radical. And so what's radicalized them is the BBC and CNN, people like you. No offense. In the reporting. So we're doing the job of de-radicalizing those who you radicalized. As former prisoners, as people who were there on the ground, we said, listen guys, what we saw when we went there in the beginning, it was a noble cause because it was part of a revolution that was happening in the Arab world. But now it's become an internal strife. Now they're executing people who've come to help. Now they're doing things, and well before they executed the Western hostages, they were executing people who opposed them before that, Muslims, and it wasn't, and it wasn't reported.
But is that working? Is that
working? It is working, and the reason why it's working is because these guys came back. They didn't come back to attack. If they came back to attack the UK, it's a different matter. But I keep returning to the same point. The empirical evidence shows they never posed a threat. The evidence from the police shows they never posed a threat. It just means that the law was interpreted as such because of policy, a policy change. But the de-radicalization process that you talk of, we've been doing it from the get-go. In the places where, you see, you can get somebody from the Quillian Foundation, for example. There's no need to de-radicalize him. So there's no point in talking to a Muslim from that organization saying he's not part of the target community. The people who are going to be radicalized, as we said, are people who are young, people who are vulnerable, but people who are ideologically or sympathetically attached to what's happening there. And we're saying, listen guys, we've seen what happens over there and the type of killing and butchery and so forth that's been done in the name of Islam, which it wasn't in the beginning. And so we are doing this. We don't need government recognition, neither do we ask for it. We don't need everybody's recognition. We're doing it because we believe it's the right thing to do. But to suggest that it's not happening, to suggest that we're not doing it, is an insult to our intelligence.
Well, maybe I could comment too. I mean, it's surprising. There's about 20 countries at least, I think, that are running de-radicalization programs. But we talk about de-radicalization, but I'd like to pick up that point that Moazzam makes. Are we talking about de-radicalization, or are we talking about disengagement from violence? There's nothing wrong with being radical, particularly. What's wrong is expressing it violently. And I think that most of the programs involve some sort of religious dialogue and so on, this sort of thing, which is fine. Okay, you can improve somebody's interpretation of their religion, but that's assuming that they're radicalized by these religious factors. And you may think some of them are, but I, in my experience, say, yeah, some of them seem very firmly like that, but underneath, I'm not so sure. I think it's much more personal factors which are causing them to be violent. So I think disengagement is possible. I agree with Moazzam that you need very credible people to say, look, okay, you can believe that, you can want that, that can be your objective, but you're not going to get it by fighting with the Islamic State. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the guy is convinced he might not get it by some other form of violence. And so it's a very, very complicated business. I will say, though, that recidivist rates from rehabilitation programs generally are not particularly high. You know, they're much, much lower than they are in, say, the prison population. But that's something to do with the people who are going through them, not necessarily the people who are conducting the programs. It's very, very difficult. We had a program at the UN to look at all these programs, try to assess them. And the fact is that the good ones are all evolving. And some of them are not so good, you know, on human rights issues and stuff like that. On your other question about whether my views changed as a result of the Charlie Hebdo and other attack in Paris, I would say not, because you know, it's a commonplace, isn't it, for us all to say you can't kill all the terrorists out there. You know, that's the solution is not to kill them all. It's impossible anyway. But also, I think the solution is not to criminalize them all. I mean, that's not going to stop them either. I don't think any of them give a damn what the law says. I mean, they're probably quite aware that what they're doing is against the law. So there has to be some other form of doing that, and it still comes down to the influences around them. It still comes down to whether they feel those deep sense of alienation, lack of identity or whatever. If you look at the Kouachi brothers, for example, their background and history, broken family, you know, no father figure, which is very common, unfortunately, for many of these people, you know, loss in society, no sense of opportunity, of progression, no sense of engagement and belonging, you know, no sense of empowerment, all those sorts of things, which many, many young people feel, of course. And then they took that line, and then maybe they were unradicalized for a bit, then they got re-radicalized a bit and whatever, and they're just like the attack in Ottawa, in Sydney, in New York, in Boston even, the Tsaneevs, all fairly similar, I would say, and you can go back and back beyond that. I wouldn't include the 2005 bombings, because I think there was a very definite training and indoctrination, in fact, abroad for that. But if you read, there was a very good op-ed in the New York Times, I think it was today, I don't know if you saw it. Did you see that?
Yeah,
really
about
a Dutch guy, young Dutch guy, who was very, very radicalized by a debate at school when he was about 10
about
or 12.
Salman Rushdie's
about satanic verses. And then, you know, over time, he explains how he understood that. So this de-radicalization for him was a process of maturity, of maturing. And I think that opportunity to mature in a society that values your maturity is a fantastic thing that this guy had. Clearly, you know, he was relatively well educated, he had opportunity and so on. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in many societies around the world, and unfortunately in many, and as you said, I'd like to come back to that because he made a very important point, Moazzam, among many of course, is that the main threat of foreign fighters is to Middle East and North Africa. It's not to Europe. You know, there are thousands of people there from Middle East and North Africa, which are going to be a real problem when they go home, in my opinion, because their protest is at the whole business of governance, the whole business of how a Muslim majority state organizes itself, and disengaging them from violence. You know, Tunisia is the only really successful, or so far successful, Arab Spring country. But that, in my view, that Arab Spring movement has not finished. We had a pendulum swing that way. We've had it swing back this way with Sisi and so on in Egypt and all that. It's going to swing back the other way. You know, it's going to come to some sort of middle. And I'm very optimistic, actually, about the development over a generation in the Middle East. But right now, it's a bit of a problem. Yeah.
Can I ask the question?
Yes.
Like I say, thanks. You pose a question on what the Muslim community can do to, you know, take on the radicalization of Muslims, and I was wondering if we could turn it on its head slightly, and maybe look at, say, how in the 1930s and the 1940s, how the German populace had become radicalized in the sense that they abdicated their ability to think the moral authority, to the government, to the media, the different journalists at that time, and they ended up causing horrific activities on the Jewish population. But it was mainly about critical thinking and moral authority which actually enabled that to happen. So we're here, we see potential Muslims here, we have Muslims abroad, but the key point is we don't seem to look at ourselves, at what we do. We always look at imams, but it was the populace that allowed the German army, the government, to attack the Jews at that time. And I'm quite surprised at the level of how our debates seem to be quite on a whole number of networks, why that critical thinking is gone. We're discussing how do we detect whether this next door neighbor is going to be radicalized. How do we look at de-radicalizing? Why don't we find out, well, okay, why was there a change in, say, foreign policy where we're supporting the Free Syrian Army and we're not supporting them now? Or, for example, why our religious hatred laws are biased against? We want to understand why they're becoming radicalized. Well, you have religious hatred laws that protect many different groups, Jewish folks, black people, Sikhs. But then those kind of laws aren't protecting Muslims at the same time. So what I'm just trying to say is that we need to think more about what we're doing, about whether it's policies at home, whether it's policies abroad, rather than looking at just the superficial, taking a superficial angle on what is important.
Sure, and I think Shiraz touched on it briefly, talking about the coalition bombings, and I would say that you cannot look at the issue of returning fighters in a vacuum without looking at the sort of giant festering wound that is Syria. And the international community's reaction or lack thereof. Obviously, you can't see the two as separate from one another. There is
we don't seem to spend enough time on the whys, do we? We seem to look at, we skirt around, and you can see it whether you're watching TV, the BBC, the ITV News. We don't look at, okay, why do we do this? Why have we chosen to support the Assad regime as opposed to who are supporting the Free Syrian Army? And I guess those are the kind of questions of the populace. We don't seem to get the answers.
Moazzam, do you think we need to be doing more soul searching as a country and as a...
I just want to test something. Can you put your hand up if you have ever heard the name Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi? I count like around 10 people. That's disgusting. And I tell you why it's disgusting. Because he's the reason why we went to war in Iraq. When I was held by the CIA in Bagram, they told me that if you don't cooperate, we'll do to you what we did to Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. Either we'll send you to Syria or we'll send you to Egypt, which is what we did to him. He was sent in a coffin while he was alive to the USS Bataan and then on to Egypt. In Egypt, he was tortured under the intelligence chief Omar Suleiman, under Mubarak. During his torture, he gave a confession that he, as a member of Al-Qaeda, a senior ranking member of Al-Qaeda, which he wasn't, was working with Saddam Hussein on obtaining weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell took that confession as credible evidence when he offered it to the United Nations Security Council in 2003, and it was cited as one of the evidences to enter Iraq. Now, when the coalition forces entered Iraq, Al-Qaeda didn't exist there. It only came in the form of Zarqawi and others afterwards. Zarqawi created the movement, I forget its name, but it later became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq then became Islamic State in Iraq. Islamic State in Iraq then became Islamic State in Iraq and Sham. Islamic State in Iraq and Sham then became Islamic State. Who caused that to happen? It's obvious. It's so blatantly obvious. Who's been prosecuted from the West for making that happen? Nobody. What accountability has there been? None. How many people have died? To be honest with you, nobody cares because nobody counts, and that's a pun. And so when we're sitting here pointing fingers at what took place over there, perhaps we need to look at why were 17 members of the leadership of IS held in Camp Booker, dressed in orange suits. I thought they were doing the orange suits because of us in Guantánamo to show solidarity. I forgot that they were using orange suits in Camp Booker in Abu Ghraib. So these people who survived or saw or witnessed the occupation in Abu Ghraib are the whirlwind that is being reaped of what we did there. Do you seriously think you can invade a country and cause that much oppression and that much strife and there will be no response? That's precisely what's happening. And that's what has happened, and that's why we're here today.
So in that sense, Moazzam, do you see it as inevitable, no matter what steps we take, whether, returnees from these, is this sort of clash, this continued clash, is it going to continue inevitably because of the reasons that you're talking about, which are way above all of our pay grades?
Look, I think Shiraz mentioned it, but these things are sort of skimmed over. Nobody really understands the point. They bombed Iraq. Okay, fine. Recently they bombed IS. But they also bombed al-Nusra Front. They also bombed Ahrar al-Sham, which is part of the Islamic Front, which is the largest rebel group in the whole of Syria. I spoke to somebody recently from Ahrar al-Sham, and he told me that we were fighting IS. Nobody was fighting IS harder or stronger than the al-Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham. Nobody was. In fact, anybody who could have taken them on, it was these two groups. Anybody could have taken them on, it was these two groups. Though they would not like to admit it. That's the fact. But he said, since that happened, we have now had a ceasefire with them, and in fact, numerous people have gone on to join them. So, this is directly the result of either, it's one or two, either the policy is deliberate, and I can't think that it wasn't, or it's extremely stupid and deliberate. Either way, what it's doing is producing this, it is making that divide. It is forcing people to be on sides. It is, and we hear it again and again with the new things that have been said in France, which I really don't want to comment about too much, but only that in the wake of the war on terror, Bush said, you're either with us or with the terrorists. He never left a space for a middle ground. There would have been no Switzerland in his war on terror had he had his way. So the middle ground is what needs to be repopulated, but it can't while people are being bombed and killed. And as Shiraz said quite clearly, we went to war in Iraq on the premise that there may possibly be chemical weapons in Iraq, that they may be, and they weren't. Chemical weapons have been used and have been recognized by the United Nations numerous times in Syria. Red lines that the Obama administration said clearly that chemical weapons are a red line, that if they cross, they'll face our wrath. Well, they've been crossed many times. It hasn't made any difference. The people in Syria have seen this. So if you go on the ground in Syria, know that they're sick to death of the war. They'll take anything to stop the war if necessary. But they don't look at America and the West in a good light, because they feel they've been abandoned totally. That the red lines that they spoke about was a complete hypocrisy. So the pull towards the radicalized groups is obvious. Why wouldn't they go there?
If I can just pick up very quickly off the back of that, actually, there's some really important case studies. Again, if we go back in the sort of the history of this uprising, the real, I think the moment it shifted, the moment it became very clear this was going to have to be a war rather than a peaceful uprising, was when the siege of Bab al-Amr took place. And at that moment, it became very clear this was a zero-sum game, and that the Assad regime was going to stop it. Had nothing to keep its grip on power. Now, those guys who were there, who were taking in the journalists, who were risking their lives, obviously the guys who took in Marie Colvin, for example, and Remy and those guys, they were at that stage, not sort of quite so radicalized. They were saying, look, we want to remove this regime. But as Moazzam saying, that if you look at the average Syrian person, regardless of what perspective they started from, today there is no buy-in for the West at all. They're saying, not only did you abandon us, surrender us to this regime, which then had its way with us, and obviously there were different people on the ground in Syria calling for different things. Some wanted no-fly zone, some wanted lethal aid support, all of which I believe could have helped them at that moment tip the balance in 2012. But now you're at this point. There's this famous guy, we were talking about him earlier. I've forgotten his name, unfortunately. But he was a footballer. He was a goalkeeper, aspiring guy from Baba Amr, secular rebel guy who's now. There are conflicting reports about whether he's joined IS or not. But the point is, if he hasn't, he's on that edge, right? And that's the average Syrian position today, because they're saying, look, not only did you deny us, but then you came in and you bombed Islamic State. And as much as the West says, these bombs against Islamic State, well, we're not collaborating with Assad, we're not working with Assad. It doesn't matter. The fact that you are hitting these different groups, IS, Jabhat al-Nusra, you're fundamentally weakening that and you're strengthening Assad's hand in this thing. So, when you talk about our responses as a society, actually partly as a society, we are in large effect responsible for this, because there was an attitude in this country when you want to talk about the suffering of the Syrian people, they said, leave them to it. We've had enough, let it burn. That was the fundamental. You could not say something, you could not write something. If you read the below the line comments, which is always a bad thing to do, if you go below the line on any article in 2012 and look at the suffering, or even in 2011, and people talk about the suffering of the Syrian people, the civilians, who are just being rained upon by this regime indiscriminately, people said, let it burn. Not our problem. And so, when you talk to these early guys, Yemen's being a good example, and they go out to Syria, they said, no one was coming to help. We had to come and help. So in a flip way, there's a flip side to this, where you talk about the radicalization of intervention. We intervened in Iraq, it radicalized people. It's almost like a radicalization of omission here as well taking place. These guys saying, you didn't come in, so we have to come in, right?
I just want to come in there because, to say that the West is doing nothing to help the Syrian people is ridiculous. When you think that there are about 3 million refugees, there's maybe 6 or 7 million internally displaced people. That's about half the population of Syria. Then there's 200,000 or so being killed. Who are the biggest donors for the UN agencies looking after the refugees? Number 1 is America. Number 2 is the UK. UK is the second biggest donor on that. I'm sorry? Refugees, about 3 million now. Oh, I'm not talking about accepting them. You want 3 million Syrian refugees to come to the UK? It would be impossible to accommodate them all and deal with them all. But they are in camps around. They are in Jordan. They are in Turkey. Some of them are in the Kurdish area. Some of them are in Lebanon, but not classed as refugees. And it's becoming a real strain on those countries. And it's those people want to get out, or they have been forced out. And they're at least being paid for, if not accommodated, by mainly Western governments. That's one thing. And the second thing is, in many ways, I think it's enormously arrogant to the West to say, well, we should go in and sort out the problems of Syria. Problems of Syria, A, need to be sorted out by Syrians, and B, need to be sorted out between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia have the responsibility, in my view, to try to deal with this whole issue of sectarianism in Middle East, which is, I think, fundamental to so much of the problems that are going on.
Richard, the only problem with that, of course, as you all know, we've said this several times, that what about Libya? Why did we intervene in Libya and not in Syria?
Well,
and I'll tell you why. We all know why. It's that 3-letter word.
If you
and you see, what we've got here is a major problem of its interests. Isn't it? It's interest. It's like Lord Palmerston said, we have no perpetual friends, we have no perpetual enemies, only our interests are perpetual. So let's not talk about it being the right and the moral thing to do. If people say it's about interests, I would be, I'd accept that. I'd say, okay, but don't talk about, or the government, I'm not saying that you are, the government shouldn't talk about what is the right thing to do and what isn't, because it changes according to interests.
But as I said earlier, I think it's driven. What American policy is, what UK policy is, and probably most of the Western world policy is driven by domestic considerations and not foreign considerations. And we have to remember that. You can call it interests, but they are essentially, these are politicians. Politicians are responding to domestic pressures more than overseas pressures. Yes.
I just want to quickly just respond on that point. I wasn't making the point that we're not doing anything or that there's no support coming from the West. What I'm saying is when the Syrians themselves were asking for very specific things in late 2011, early 2012, we didn't give them those things.
Other than generators.
Other
generators.
You know, and
what would have happened had we done that?
How many jihadis are operating in USA tents, for example?
You can't look back at history and say, if we'd done that, it would have been absolutely right.
No,
we don't know.
But what I'm saying is, I feel the population is lost
unknown.
through a lack of our support for them at that time.
Richard, how do you think the government ought to deal with those of our allies that export extremist ideology around the world, and how do you think the government ought to deal with those countries that have terror watch lists and have placed organizations on those watch lists, not because they are a security threat, but because of political reasons? The most immediate one, only because I was there a few weeks ago, is the UAE, which has got organizations such as the Cordoba Foundation, perfectly respectable organization that we have in this country, and of course the Brotherhood. A very short question for you, Moazzam. Oh, by the way, on your credible interlocutors, I have studied most of the de-radicalizations programs around the world, and I must say that one of the most impressive has been Indonesia, which has actually used former members of JI as the credible interlocutors to de-radicalize people. But the point I wanted to make was your issue that you raised on accountability. Now that we know the extent of US torture since the publication of the US intelligence report on torture, and you will know more than most, and I have to say that when I read the Guardian account, I actually suffered PTSD just reading that. It is absolutely horrendous, and it beggars belief what one human being can do to another. How much more radicalization do you think that will generate for those people who read that?
Yeah, you're the boss.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Małgorzata Skowrońska. I'm a recent graduate from King's College London. My question is, actually been said that the British government supported Free Syrian Army to a certain point, obviously. And I guess there was also various organizations or individuals that also supported fighters in the Free Syrian Army. My question is, can we actually blame them or accuse them for the fact that somewhere on the line, some of the parts of the Free Syrian Army defected or became more radical or created their own radical groups? And don't you think that we had to take the risk of supporting some of the elements of the Free Syrian Army simply because otherwise they would seek help maybe from radical groups to fight against the Assad? Don't you think that we had to take the risk? And obviously it didn't work out in some ways and with some groups, but maybe it has to be done. And also, just quickly, I see also some inconsistency in your replies, because you said that we supported the Syrian army and created terrorists because now they're jihadists. But then I think you said that we didn't give enough support, and that's why Syrians hate us, because we didn't come with the help. So I think whatever we do is still going to work out wrong. You can't predict the conflict. Conflicts live their own life. They deform. You can't predict that. So I think we also have to take into account that.
Just take one more quickly.
Yeah, I'm Carlo Chico. I'm a former official of the European Parliament, now retired. So nothing what I say has anything to do with European Parliament. I'm simply joining what has been said, meaning that anything that the West would have done, whether it had intervened or not intervened, it would have been criticized anyway. No problem about that. But my question is another one, and it's probably to Mr. Maher, is does he see a specificity into radicalization and de-radicalization of converts to Islam, as opposed to, let's call them, native Muslims or re-Islamized Muslims, people who already have this kind of background? Is there a specificity he sees? Thank you.
That's interesting. Are converts more overzealous?
No, is the is the a simple answer to that. No, yeah, I know people have tried to look into it, and have tried to study whether there's something unique or specific to converts, but no, is the long answer as well.
It's interesting that in French foreign fighters, I think 22% of them, according to the French authorities, are converts. And that suggests to me that these are people typically who are looking for this sort of identity, this sort of belonging. Okay, they happen to convert to Islam, but they might have done something else. So I'm not sure what conclusions you can draw from that, quite frankly.
And so on to the lady's question before. Are we damned if we do, damned if we don't, in terms of...
Well, maybe I'll maybe go to Shiraz's question, because you asked about the export of Wahhabism. You asked about the spread of this very Salafist sort of interpretation of Islam. There are many countries in the world who are extremely concerned about that and see that as a major problem. And the Saudis are not unaware of the issue. The Saud side, the ruling side of the country, but they are going through a very difficult time. You've got a king who may be dead or may be close to death, or anyway, is going to die soon, like we all will, but he might die sooner than some of us. And they have a very difficult succession. They're still locked into that generation. The Salman, the Crown Prince, Mukrin, the second Crown Prince, are both of the same generation, so they still have to go down to the next generation. A time of great instability for them. They have this was back in the beginning of last year that they said they had 300 foreign fighters back in the rehab centres. To add on to that all the foreign fighters who come back to Saudi, and there are probably about 3,000 of them at a conservative estimate in Iraq or Syria. So add to them those coming back, they have an internal stability problem. They had the attack on the border, you remember the other day, on the border with Iraq, which they have now said was caused by members of a deviant group. So we don't know whether that means Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, but certainly somebody in that spectrum, because there's no difference between them ultimately. And they have Yemen to worry about as well. So they have all sorts of things going on, and it's not a really good time to push forward some of the reforms that King Abdullah has made to try and get that extremist element in the education program out of it. And so if you read Saudi textbooks that are given in schools, there's a lot of sectarianism in there. There's a lot of very stuff that we just wouldn't agree with at all, just from a point of view of critical thinking, which was mentioned, human rights and so on, tolerance and all that sort of thing. I don't think that is going to change anytime soon. I don't know what you guys think, but I think that the king also tried to persuade the ulama to talk against some of the radical preaching. And there was a bit of it, but I think it was pretty half-hearted in my view. I think there's still quite a lot of it goes on. So we don't see any early reform, I wouldn't have thought, in Saudi Arabia. And countries like UAE, which are, more sort of, perhaps tolerant societies, listing all those groups that they said were terrorist. Well, yeah, what do you do about that? Some of them we would agree with, because a lot of them were also mentioned on the United Nations lists. And some of them, of course, we would say, well, why do you call them terrorists? And that tarring a political movement with a terrorist brush, of course, is very easy for a state to do. And there should be proper international agreements on definition of terrorism, on the way you treat a terrorist group, what sanctions you apply to it. And maybe that'll come, but it hasn't come yet. And in the meantime, of course, states will pursue whatever advantage they see through terrorism to achieve other ends, perhaps. So just a fact of life, I would say.
Just in relation to your question about does the torture that we endured and the other numerous prisoners cause radicalization? It should do. It should. Because I think if any of you were tortured, if somebody did to you what they call rectal hydration, in other words, rape, if somebody carried out an extraordinary rendition on you, which is kidnap, abduction and false imprisonment, if somebody detained you without charge or trial and called you a detained rightly as an enemy combatant, I think you'd be very upset, to say the least. What we've done, however, the former prisoners of Guantánamo, particularly the UK ones, but especially the European ones, is what nobody has done. And that is, we've reached out to the American guards and soldiers who were our captors, who held us in custody while our children were being born that we never saw until we were released. We brought them to our homes to meet our children, and we've toured with them and spoken with them and welcomed them and hugged them as friends. At least those ones who felt that what they were doing was a gross violation of our human rights and against humanity. That hasn't been reciprocated. None of us, not one prisoner, is allowed on the soil of the United States of America. To this day, they're not ready. They're not prepared to face up to it. The fact that this report came out and it only dealt with 119 prisoners who were held in CIA custody, not the thousands who were held in military custody, not those who were held in Abu Ghraib or in Bagram or Kandahar or Guantánamo. It dealt with those CIA prisoners, which were certainly some of the worst cases, but it doesn't address at all the mass of various types of torture and it is torture. There is no confusion about that. It is torture. If we were to practice any of those things here in our society, we would be successfully prosecuted for torture, for false imprisonment, for kidnapping. Yet because governments have done it, somehow they've got an immunity. So in terms of accountability, there hasn't been any. Nobody's been prosecuted, ever. None of these criminals who carried out these acts of torture have been prosecuted, ever. So what message does that send to everybody else? We as the prisoners, the former prisoners, the overwhelming majority of us, 650 plus of us most dangerous prisoners on earth, as Bush called us, have been released. And if we were that dangerous, you would have known about it by now. But the truth is that the rest of the world sees what Guantánamo is and what the CIA torture program led to. Everybody talks about it. In Syria, the people I went to meet with, several of them who are now leaders of various rebel groups, were victims of rendition. In Libya, it was the same. The leadership, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, one of the leaders of the Syrian rebels, was a rendition victim himself. So it's unsurprising that they've channeled it in one direction. But other people who, we could say, get angry on our behalf, what are we going to say to them? There's no accountability process. So yes, it is going to cause radicalization, and it has. When I came back from Guantánamo in 2005, I remember I made an appeal to hostages, or for hostage takers, who were holding 4 citizens, 1 British, 2 Canadian and 1 American. The American was executed. And we made an appeal to the former Guantánamo prisoners for only one reason, because they were dressed in orange suits. It reminded us of our own ordeal. And mercifully they were released in the end after we made the appeal. But the trauma of this has resonated throughout the world. In response to your question, I just wanted to say this, is that I'm not talking about, and never have in any way talked about or asked for intervention. I agree that it seems that if you don't do it, then you're damned, and if you do it, you're damned. I agree with that. But I'm saying don't do it. Because I'm saying the evidence of what happens when we do it can be seen in Iraq. Nobody's asking for it. What I'm saying is don't prosecute us because we do it, or because those people who have come back, or those people who went for benign reasons, not for the sake of terrorism, to protect the population. I'm asking again, what crime did they do? That's all. Not asking for intervention.
Got one more quick question at the back.
Thank you. Hi, this is just a question for Richard. And I wanted to ask about the use, to go back to the returning foreign fighters from Syria. What use, intelligence-wise, could these people serve? I've spoken to some of the British Islamic State fighters, and from my understanding of the people that I spoke to, they're not involved in senior decision-making. They have no idea really about the reality of ISIS strategy. They serve a mainly propaganda role. They spend all their time tweeting, and what can they bring to the table apart from massive propaganda points? So when they come back, what is their intelligence value to the security services, and how important is the information that you that if there is much real strategic information that they can give to the British security services?
Well, I think that I don't accept the framing of the question, really. The people who are coming back shouldn't be seen as some sort of resource which can be immediately used against the Islamic State or something. These are citizens of the country to which they're returning to, and they need all the help they can get to reintegrate into society. This is a very important point, that if you go abroad to fight, there's no logical progression from that to being a terrorist when you come home. There are two completely different activities, going abroad to fight and being a domestic terrorist. Sure, those people may have fought with people that you want to know about, but why do you want to know about it? If you want to know, yeah, these are the guys and this is where they're hanging out and this is where their bunker is, and you can go and bomb them, I'm not sure that that's a very respectable question to ask somebody to answer. Maybe that's slightly off the point. If you want to understand about the strategy and tactics of the Islamic State, it's very unlikely that a returning foreign fighter will actually have anything of value to say about that. And even if he had, probably be some months out of date. So what is the value of these people? The real value of the returning foreign fighter is to understand more about the motivation of people who go. Understand more about the motivation of people who are there and didn't come back, and understand also the motivation of the people who might come back. Because fundamentally what we're trying to do as United Kingdom, or what you might be trying to do in France or Australia or in Russia or Saudi Arabia or anywhere like that, is to understand what do we need to do to persuade young people that this is not a very good course of action. This is not going to satisfy what they want, and give them some alternative which does offer better satisfaction for those needs than they think they're going to get in the Islamic State. That's, I think, the number 1, 2 and 3 reason for talking to these people and trying to get their story, if you like, not their information but their story from them.
Thank you so much. So many more questions, I know. Such interesting speakers. Big hand. Thank you.